do you find your way back in the dark?
Just head for that big star straight on. The highway's under it. It'll take us right home.
In November 1960, Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, died of a heart attack. He was 59 years old. He left behind a pregnant wife, a fortune, a career so legendary that studios had built their entire decades around his name, and a secret. That secret was a daughter he had never acknowledged. A daughter who grew up being told she was adopted. A daughter who, at 7 years old, was taken to a doctor and had her ears surgically altered, pinned back, to hide her resemblance to the man who had fathered her, and then looked away. And on the other side of that secret, a son, born 4 months after Clark Gable died. A boy who inherited the name, the legend, the photographs on every wall, and a father he would never meet. 2 children, 2 entirely different fates. One man at the center of both, present for neither. This is not a story about the king of Hollywood's greatness. That story has been told 1,000 times. This is the story of what his greatness cost. Quick pause before we get into the architecture of this empire. We are building something real here, a channel built on the stories that the official histories leave out. The children, the costs, the quiet devastation behind the famous names. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this community makes the next story possible. And tell me in the comments, which part of this hit you hardest? Judy's surgery? John's quiet life? The line about not giving a damn? I read every comment. I want to know. Chapter 1, The Golden Facade. Clark Gable did not begin as a king. He began in Cadiz, Ohio in 1901, the son of an oil driller. His mother died when he was 10 months old. He was raised by a stepmother in a household defined by physical labor, practicality, and little tolerance for sentiment. He drove tractors. He worked farm equipment. He was strong, restless, and visibly bored by every horizon available to him in rural Ohio. He made his way toward acting through sheer persistence and physical presence, neither of which came naturally to the industry's idea of a leading man in the early 1920s. His ears were famously large. Studios initially dismissed him. He was considered too rough, too unpolished, not quite the right kind of handsome. And then somehow he became the definition of the right kind of handsome. What Clark Gable projected on screen was something the movies of the 1930s celebrated above almost everything else. A casual, unapologetic masculine confidence that read as completely unconstructed. Other actors performed charm. Gable seemed indifferent to whether you noticed his. That indifference was the performance, and audiences couldn't look away from it. By 1934, he had won the Academy Award for It Happened One Night. By the end of the decade, he was cast as Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, a role so culturally enormous that declining it would have been unthinkable, and accepting it made him permanently synonymous with a single iconic line. Hollywood built a mythology around him. The king, the man's man, the effortlessly dominant figure who needed nothing and wanted everything. Fan mail arrived in volumes that required dedicated staff to manage. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. The mask was extraordinarily well made. What lived behind it was a man who was, in private, capable of profound and lasting absence. Not cruelty in any dramatic sense. Something quieter, and in its own way more damaging. He simply looked away, from the people who needed him most. And in the years before all of that legend calcified, something had already happened that he would never publicly acknowledge. Chapter 2, The Inciting Transgression. In 1935, Clark Gable and Loretta Young were cast together in The Call of the Wild. They were sent on location to the mountains of Washington state, Mount Baker, remote and cold, far from the social structures and studio surveillance that regulated behavior in Hollywood's carefully managed ecosystem. Loretta Young was 22. Clark Gable was 34 and, at the time, married to his second wife, Rhea Langham. He was one of the most powerful men in the industry. She was a devout Catholic actress whose public image was built on propriety and faith. What happened on that location shoot has been described differently by different people across the decades. Loretta Young herself, in a 1998 television interview conducted shortly before her death, described what occurred as something that happened without her full consent. A statement that arrived 60 years after the fact and was received with the complicated weight such statements carry when they emerge so late and from someone so far outside the normal channels of recourse. What is not in dispute is this: Loretta Young became pregnant. And what followed required one of the most elaborate deceptions in the history of Hollywood. The studio system of the 1930s was not a place that accommodated scandal with grace. It managed it, suppressed it, and buried it, with the full cooperation of everyone who needed the machinery to keep running. A pregnancy resulting from an affair between a married man and one of the industry's most publicly virtuous actresses was precisely the kind of thing the system was designed to erase. Clark Gable's name was kept out of it entirely, not through some carefully negotiated agreement, simply through omission, through silence, through the collective decision of powerful people to act as though a specific fact did not exist. He did not dispute it. He did not claim it. He did not, in any documented account, make any sustained private effort to acknowledge what he had fathered. He moved forward. The machinery moved forward with him. And somewhere in it, a child was coming into the world. A child who would spend the better part of her life trying to understand why she had been built to be invisible. Chapter 3. The Elaborate Deception and Trauma. Loretta Young left Hollywood. She traveled to Europe, disappeared from public life for several months, and returned without a visible pregnancy. The baby, a girl, was born in November 1935 and placed initially in an orphanage under a false arrangement. Several months later, Loretta Young announced that she was adopting a child. She named the baby Judy. The deception was complete. On paper. In reality, it was immediately visible to anyone paying attention. Judy had Clark Gable's ears. Large, distinctive, unmistakable. The resemblance was not subtle. It was the kind of resemblance that answers questions before they are asked, which meant that the questions had to be prevented from being asked in the first place. So when Judy was 7 years old, Loretta Young took her to a doctor and had her ears surgically altered. Pinned back, reshaped. A 7-year-old girl underwent surgery. Not for her health, not for her comfort, to protect her mother's secret. The ears were too recognizable. They were changed. That is not a metaphor. That is a thing that happened to a child's body so that the adults around her could continue to maintain a lie. Judy grew up knowing something was wrong before she knew what it was. She has described a childhood defined by an unnameable wrongness. A sense of being slightly outside the story she was officially part of. Her mother was warm in some ways and withholding in others, with a quality that Judy eventually came to understand as guilt wearing the face of love. She found out the truth the way many people in these situations do, obliquely over time, through accumulating evidence that the official story could not account for. By adulthood she knew. She confronted her mother. Loretta Young's response was not an apology, not an explanation, not an embrace. It was a declaration of her own shame, framed in religious language that centered her suffering rather than her daughter's. Judy was in her 30s before she was able to fully name what had been done to her. She eventually wrote a memoir. She spoke publicly about her father, her mother, and the surgery. She described the experience of growing up as a secret, not merely kept, but actively dismantled, her very physical form altered to sustain someone else's narrative. She had done nothing. She had simply been born. And across the decades of her childhood and young adulthood, Clark Gable, the man whose features were stamped so clearly on her face that doctors had been called in to address them, never reached out, never acknowledged her. He was busy being the king. Chapter 4. The Second Fate / the Paradox. In 1955, Clark Gable married Kay Williams Spreckles. She was his 5th wife. She was warm, grounded, and by most accounts of those who observed them, genuinely good for him. He was in his mid-50s. The wildness of his earlier decades had settled into something more domestic, more deliberate. He wanted, he told people around him, a son. He had said this before across multiple marriages. The desire for a legitimate heir, stated openly, sentimentally, sat alongside the fact of a daughter he had already produced and systematically ignored. That dissonance was never publicly addressed. It didn't need to be. Judy wasn't public. In 1960, Clark Gable began filming The Misfits, what would turn out to be his final film, alongside Marilyn Monroe. The production was grueling. The Nevada desert heat was relentless. Gable, who famously refused to use a stunt double, performed physically demanding scenes himself, repeatedly. On November 6, 1960, Judy Lewis turned 25 years old. Neither she nor her father knew they shared that particular dark coincidence. A birthday she was spending quietly, still largely in the grip of an identity shaped by concealment. On that same day, Clark Gable suffered a massive heart attack. He died 2 days later. Kay Williams Spreckles was pregnant. She gave birth to John Clark Gable 4 months after his father's death, in March 1961. The son Clark Gable had said he always wanted Arrive to inherit the name, the photographs, the legend, and the absence of the man himself. John Clark Gable grew up as the legitimate heir. He had his father's name on every document. He had a mother who spoke of his father with love. He had access to the mythology in a way that Judy never did. An official version of the story in which he belonged and she did not exist. And yet both of them were fatherless. That is the paradox at the center of this story. The daughter who was erased and the son who was celebrated arrived at the same place by completely different roads. One had a name and no father. The other had been given a false name specifically so that her father could remain unburdened. 2 children. The same absence, wearing different faces. Chapter 5, The Generational Echo. The weight of a legend does not stay still. It moves. John Clark Gable grew up handsome, recognizable, and perpetually in conversation with a name he had done nothing to earn and could do nothing to escape. He worked. He acted in smaller productions. He raced cars, a passion that had its own mortality risks, pursued with the kind of deliberate physical intensity that sometimes functions as a relationship with danger. He lived his life at the edge of his father's shadow, never quite inside it, and never quite free of it. He died in 2019. He was 57 years old, 2 years younger than his father at death. He had been married and divorced. He had lived in a Hollywood that was almost unrecognizable compared to the one that had made his father a king. He died quietly, without the fanfare of a legend, in a city that retained his father's name in its history, but had long since moved past the era it represented. He was the son of the man who had once been the most famous actor in the world. He was, in the end, a man who had lived with that. Judy Lewis died in 2011 at 76, having spent decades processing what had been done to her. The concealment, the surgery, the silence, and the eventual, imperfect public reckoning with all of it. Her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, published in 1994, was an act of deliberate excavation. She named things. She refused the arrangement of silence that had organized her entire childhood. She was a therapist for much of her adult life. That detail carries its own quiet devastation. The woman whose childhood had been systematically organized around protecting adults from accountability spent her professional life helping people untangle exactly that kind of damage. She had been changed, literally, physically altered, to sustain someone else's story. She had spent her life, in her own way, changing herself back. The sins of the past do not stay in the past. They find the children. They always find the children. Chapter 6, The Bitter Climax. There is a line from Gone with the Wind that belongs to Clark Gable in the way that almost nothing else does. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. It is the most quoted line in American cinema. It became a cultural shorthand for a specific kind of masculine detachment. The unbothered man, the man too secure to beg, the man who walks away clean. Judy Lewis addressed it, in her own way, in interviews near the end of her life. She said something to the effect that her father's most famous line might have been a more accurate reflection of his actual character than the legend wanted to admit. That the indifference Rhett Butler performed in that final scene was perhaps not entirely a performance. Not given a damn. Not an apology. Not a letter. Not a phone call. Not, at any point across 25 years of her life while he was still alive, an acknowledgement. Clark Gable is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His grave is visited. His films are preserved. His name remains, to this day, synonymous with a certain golden era ideal of what a man could be. But 2 children, one erased, one orphaned before he drew breath, lived the actual human cost of what the legend required. The king did not give a damn. They had to live inside that. That is what this story is actually about. More stories like this are coming. Stories about empires built on principles that everyone said were wrong, and that turned out to be the only things that were right. Be here for them. Subscribe. Comment. And I will see you on the next one.